I got a question about using variety in your training. It said, basically, when should we use variations of exercises? Should it be right away, or should we wait until we hit a plateau? For example, if your back squat plateau is switched to front squat. So first of all, if you've heard me talk about using a lot of variety in training, I'm actually not talking about this type of variety, like using variations of an exercise over time. I'm usually talking about using a broad set of exercises right away. So if we're talking about strength training, let's say you go to the gym 3 times per week. What I'm saying is you don't just do squat, bench, clean every time you go. Rather, in a training week, you're trying to hit lots of different exercises. Just off the top of my head, squat, split squat, hinge, some type of pure unilateral squat like a pistol squat, and then something for the calves, the hamstrings, the adductors, the hip flexors, and then spinal flexion, spinal rotation, maybe some side bending for the upper body, pushing, pulling, a couple different versions of both, bis, tris, etc. Now that's just strength training. I would say it's also something you want in your explosive and elastic training. You want variety there too, right? So sprinting, jumping off 1 and 2 feet, and in some different ways, plyos on 1 and 2 feet, and in different directions. Some type of agility-based activity that's multi-directional. Throwing, I think, is a good one. Tumbling is a good one, right? You want variety in your athletic movements as well. So if you hear me talk about variety in training, that's usually what I'm talking about. Now, as far as using variations of an exercise week to week, that's actually less necessary, I would say. The very well-known example of where that was sort of one of the principles of the training was the conjugate method and westside barbell, right? Where they were doing, they had a max effort session every week, and they would do a different version of squat or deadlift in that session. And the reasoning behind that, as I understand it, is they're trying to avoid what they call accommodation, which is a staleness or a fatigue that's going to come from maxing out the same variation of a lift week in, week out. So another way to phrase it would be it's a way of managing training stress. Okay? They're using variety for that purpose. Of course, there are many ways to manage training stress. The obvious way of managing your training stress is being strategic with your volume and intensity, right? So, Westside Barbell focused on powerlifting. They're committed to doing, I believe, a 1 or 2 or 3 rep max every week in either squat or deadlift. And so, because they're using that approach to intensity, that's why they're using variety week to week as a way of managing training stress. But, athletes outside of powerlifting probably don't need to be maxing out their squat or deadlift every week. And so, they can use other ways of managing training stress, such as just not going super heavy every week, or just having easier weeks or higher volume weeks or whatever. There's a lot of different options. So assuming you're not maxing out every week, you probably don't need to rotate variations of your exercises so much. So all that being said, beginners shouldn't actually be using lots of variations of a lift. They should actually be sticking with kind of a fundamental version of each one and just practicing it and getting good at that movement. And they don't need to be doing lots of hard sets or going super heavy anyway. So they shouldn't need to use any type of variation to manage training stress, because their training stress just really doesn't need to be that high in order for them to improve. So a beginner can just work towards doing a deep squat with a barbell, whether it's front squat or back squat, and then work on a barbell hinge and push-ups. All right, and just stick with those until you're good at them. You don't need to use variation week to week. Now, once you can perform those movements well, that's going to make variations accessible to you, right? Like if you can do a good deep back squat, then you can do any squat well. If you have a good hinge that you can take deep, then any kind of deadlift variation or hinge variation should be accessible to you. And if you can do good push-ups, then you should be able to step into any pressing exercise without too much difficulty. Okay? So that's going to open up those options to you, and then you can kind of use variation at will. But I wouldn't assume that you need to. Like I said, there's lots of ways to manage training stress through frequency and volume and intensity. And so, doing a different variation of squat every week doesn't have to be necessary. Certainly, plenty of people have gotten very strong while just doing back squat, deadlift, and bench every week. Now, there are still accessory exercises to those, but in terms of your big lifts, just hitting the basic version of it every week can certainly make you stronger over time. Now, in terms of the example in the question, which was your back squat plateaus, so you switch to front squat, yeah, I mean, you could do that, but the real question is, why did your back squat plateau? And that probably isn't like a problem with back squat, or it's not because you did back squat every week. It's probably more about the big picture, like, again, your frequency, your volume, your intensity, your nutrition, your lifestyle, all your other training that's going on, your stress levels, something in there is probably why it's plateauing. And so switching to front squat, it might give you kind of the mental relief of not having to realize that your back squat's weak this week. And because it's maybe a novel stimulus, you might get some short-term improvement in it from, doing it, a few weeks in a row. But that's not going to solve your big picture issue. That, the bigger question there is, why did your back squat plateau? And figuring that out is going to be more valuable than just switching your squat variation.